Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In the first video, we talked about why evolution by natural selection was mathematically inevitable. There was no way to avoid having evolution by natural selection if certain very simple conditions were met. We also talked about one famous example of evolution by natural selection, that of color change in the peppered moth in Great Britain and other parts of the world. Now, it may surprise you to learn after seeing that video that in many parts of the world, people don't believe in the truth of evolution. Let's talk a little bit about some of the historical challenges there and some of the issues that people are facing, particularly in the United States. Now, one of the most famous examples of opposition to evolution is the Scopes monkey trial from the 1920s. In the United States state of Tennessee, they passed a law called the Butler Act, which made teaching evolution in public schools unlawful. Now, one teacher challenged this law. His name was John Scopes. He went into his classroom, taught evolution in a very public forum. He was taken to court as a result of this, and in a very highly publicized trial, as you can see from some of these headlines, evolution trial opened by prayer, judge has a Bible. It brought out all the people who are against evolution on one side and for the teaching of evolution on the other side. Now, John Scopes did actually violate the law. As a result of that, he was actually found guilty. However, trivializing this law and showing how ridiculous it was, he was fined a mere $100, which was not that much money. So this was actually a big victory for the pro-teaching evolution community. Now, the prosecutor, the person who was basically trying to send him to jail, was William Jennings Bryan, who had previously run for president of the United States. He was extremely disappointed. He lost his chance to give a very impassioned speech against evolution. So this was a big victory. Now you may be thinking, well, this was 100 years ago. Does this kind of thing still actually happen today? The answer is yes, and not just in the United States either. Here are a few examples from just the last couple of years, long after the Scopes monkey trial, of course. The first one is from the United States state of Tennessee in Livingston Parish. Creation Science Genesis, school system looks into teaching anti-evolution. It's just from a few years ago. Even more recently, this is a case from outside the United States. South Korea surrenders to creationist demands. And very importantly, look at what they were saying. Publishers were set to remove examples of evolution from high school textbooks. So they actually have this in their standard curriculum. They're basically wanting to take it out, remove these examples from it. So there's a lot of public pressure to not talk about evolution in public schools. See the same thing in the United States state of Kansas, headed for another debate over evolution. They say another debate because there was a very highly publicized debate by one school board in Kansas from around 1999. Well, again, there's a lot of variation when you look across countries in the world. So let me show you results from a survey that focused, especially in this case, on European countries and the United States, just so you can see a couple of comparisons. So this was a survey done in 2005. The red bars indicate people who, when asked about the truth of evolution, said that evolution is, quote, false. The blue bars are people who, when asked about the truth of evolution, said evolution was true. So when you look at this, in Iceland, we have very high acceptance of evolution. About 80% say it's true, maybe 10% say it's false, and 10% are uncertain. As you see, looking at a lot of the Western European countries, France, United Kingdom, again, fairly high acceptance of the truth of evolution. Down near the very bottom, we have the United States here, where about 40% of people surveyed said that evolution was true. Fewer than half said evolution was true. This is one of the foundational pieces of biology, and less than half of people surveyed said it was even true. 40% also said it was false, and 20% said they were uncertain. This is really shocking. And again, there's a lot of variation in other countries. I'm sure if you survey other places, you will find several countries that have even lower acceptance of the truth of evolution. But again, you'll see a lot of variation place to place. They may be thinking, well, 2005 was quite some time ago. Maybe things have improved. Nope. 2009, we have even lower acceptance of the truth of evolution. So why are we still talking about this? This is the question I want to pose to you. Well, within the scientific community, there is absolutely no debate about the truth of evolution. You often hear politicians say, teach the kids the controversy and let them decide. Well, there is no controversy to teach, at least from the scientific standpoint. There is no question whatsoever about the truth of evolution. The only debates that exist about evolution are about the relative importance of different forces on particular cases. So, did the shape of my ear evolve more by an action of natural selection, or did it evolve more by random forces? That's the only kind of debates that exist. There's definitely no debate about the truth that evolution has happened, or the truth that evolution by natural selection has happened many, many times. In this context, evolution is both a theory and a fact. Now, this may sound confusing because people sometimes use the word theory very loosely, and it's not the way they use it in a scientific setting. So what do we mean when we say a scientific theory? What is a scientific theory? Well, a scientific theory is what happens when you make a hypothesis, which is an educated guess, and then verify and accept it as true through testing. Right? So you have a hypothesis, which is basically an educated guess, right? And then you test it, and if you test it and it supports the argument you're making, then it becomes accepted as true and accepted as a theory. In fact, hypotheses have to be accepted multiple times by detached groups of researchers before you can really consider it a general theory that people accept. And at that point, it would still be far below the level of acceptance for evolution. And there's so much evidence for it. We'll talk about that in one of the subsequent videos. Now, interestingly, although there's a lot of criticism about evolution as a theory, people call it just a theory quite often, particularly in the United States, there are a lot of other theories out there that don't get this sort of response. Here are a couple of examples for you. Gravity is just a theory. Whereas if I get up and stand on my desk and jump, I think you all are pretty certain that I'm going to go down and not up. So it's a theory which there's a lot of support for, just like evolution. Atoms, up until recently, nobody had seen them, but we still had the atomic theory, and you've seen what's happened from it. You go back far enough in time, germs, before people could actually see them, were a theory, right? That, people could argue the reason this person is getting sick is because of witchcraft, rather than saying that there's microorganisms that are transmitted from sick people through their breathing and their sneezes to other people. So there's, again, this idea that because it's a theory, it's not been proven yet. But in fact, evolution has been proven multiple times by detached groups of researchers. Now, part of the resistance comes from this appearance of design. That when you look at the world around us, things seem amazingly well suited to the environment that they're in. Here's an excerpt from Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True, which is recommended for this class. Species seem intricately and almost perfectly designed for living their lives. That's Jerry Coyne, by the way, over there. This appearance of design is what makes people think, okay, this can't be from something impersonal like evolution by natural selection, but there has to be something guiding it. But in fact, natural selection causes this appearance of design. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on. I encourage you, by the way, in the meantime, to look at this video on YouTube. This video shows the example of the Lampsilus mussel. This is this right here. If you look at this right here, next to the Lampsilus mussel, that is not a fish. That is actually part of the Lampsilus mussel. That is a lure that sticks out from it, and the mussel waves it around to draw in other fish. When other fish come, it spits out its young into their gills, and they clamp onto their gills and develop inside the fish. So this is something that seems amazing when you see it, but it's something that happened as a result of natural selection. Now you may be wondering, why am I pushing this so hard? Why does it matter? How does studying evolution help humanity? This is the question I want to pose to you. Now let me start this section by talking briefly about one medical application. We'll come back to this topic for an entire lecture later on in the semester. So one medical application where we can see the action of evolution by natural selection is in what's happened with antibiotic resistance. Back in the 1920s, penicillin was discovered to be an antibiotic chemical. That basically, by taking penicillin, you could prevent infections from staph bacteria. This was amazing, and this was the reason this is pushed in this particular slide here is because during World War II, you could say, thanks to penicillin, this injured soldier won't die from staph infections, and he will come home. As a result of this, penicillin was mass-produced first around 1943. It was the wonder drug. Things changed, though, very shortly after that. In 1947, the first resistant strain of staph was discovered. That even when penicillin was applied to the patient, the staph bacteria did not die. This was cause for some concern. That concern became much greater very shortly after that. By 1950, 40% of staph isolates were resistant to penicillin. 40%, that's almost half the time. It didn't matter if you took penicillin or not. By 1960, 80% of staph isolates were resistant to penicillin. So you may be thinking to yourself, when was the last time you had penicillin? Not any antibiotic, but penicillin in particular. There's a high probability that most of you watching this have not had it in the recent past. And the reason is because nearly all staph bacteria isolates out there are resistant to penicillin. How did this happen? Well, this happened because of the very basic evolutionary principle of evolution by natural selection. In the original population of staph bacteria, you had these blue ones. They weren't actually blue. I just did this for the picture. You had these blue ones which were susceptible to penicillin. That when penicillin was applied, they died. You had a very small fraction of red ones which were actually resistant to penicillin. So when the antibiotic was applied, tons of people all over the world were taking it. Sometimes when they didn't need to take it, there was no competition for the resistant strain. All the blue ones were killed off. The red ones there by itself, it was able to spread. And what's happened? This is more like what the population of staph bacteria looks like in the world today. Virtually all the strains out there are resistant to penicillin. The reason for this, and the lesson to be learned here, is that antibiotics were, and very often are, still overprescribed. By taking antibiotics when you don't need them, you actually make the population of staph in the world more resistant. And that makes it harder for the people who actually do need the antibiotics. So it's very important to only take antibiotics when you really need them. Don't take them as a precautionary thing. It's very bad. There's another problem from antibiotics that I want to introduce briefly, and this also has to do with evolution. Humans have co-evolved with many bacteria. We actually have bacteria that synthesize our vitamin K. This is an essential vitamin for us, and bacteria within our bodies synthesize this. They also help us to resist invading organisms. Bacteria within our bodies help us resist invading fungi, for example. Many of the women out there will know that when you're taking antibiotics, you're much more likely to get a yeast infection. Again, it's because you're killing off the good bacteria, the ones that are helping you resist that yeast. So more generally, antibiotics kill the good stuff too. The consequences from this can be quite large. There was a 2011 study of irritable bowel syndrome. And what it shows here is that kids that had no courses of antibiotics had a fairly low risk of irritable bowel syndrome. As you had more and more antibiotic treatments, you had a higher and higher risk of irritable bowel syndrome. So again, antibiotics kill off the good stuff. The reason that we have good bacteria is because we have co-evolved with our bacteria. That we, over time, have developed this mutualistic relationship with them. Now, in the next couple of videos, I'll be talking about specific cases of evidence for evolution and examples that you can use to talk with your friends who may not know about them thus far. So I hope you'll join us, and thank you for coming. Hello, welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In this set of videos, we've talked about how natural selection is a mathematical inevitability. We've talked about how there's variation in the acceptance of the truth of evolution across various countries and some of the reasons for that. We've talked a little bit about evidence for evolution and common ancestry of species. I'll recap that in just a second. So in this video, what I'd like to do is respond to some of the criticisms of evolutionary theory that are leveled particularly by the media and by non-scientists. So first, to recap, again, some of the points we've already raised, is we've seen examples of natural selection in real time. I talked with you, for example, about the case of the peppered moth and the change in its color over time in Great Britain and in other parts of the world. We've also seen the same sort of thing with respect to antibiotic resistance in various bacteria. We talked about extensive evidence for evolution and common ancestry in the fossil record. We've talked about cases of vestigial organs. These are organs which don't have a function in present-day species in the ones that you're looking at. However, other modern species or their ancestors presumably had functions associated with this. We've talked about vestigial genes, which are very similar to vestigial organs, except we're just looking at the genes producing these. We've talked about evidence from biogeography, where animals live or where plants live, being consistent with this idea of common ancestry and evolution. And finally, I talked briefly about a case of inefficient design. Something that if you were to actually design an animal from scratch, it wouldn't really make sense. However, when we consider its ancestors and this working with the materials available, it made a lot more sense. So some of you may be thinking, well, are there any observations that actually would falsify evolution? The answer is yes, there are a few. So one of them would be fossils in the wrong place. I mentioned to you before the famous quote from J.B.S. Haldane about fossil rabbits in the Precambrian would certainly falsify the truth of evolution and common descent of species, common ancestry of species. Mammals in the Devonian would do the same. Adaptations in one species that are only good for a second species, that would definitely not be consistent with the idea of evolution by natural selection. Adaptations that could not have evolved in a step-by-step process, those are things that, again, would be very difficult to reconcile with evolution by natural selection. And I'll show you a proposed case of that in just a second and show you why it's not the case. Evolved altruistic behaviors among non-relatives in animals that don't exhibit social behavior. Again, that would be a challenge for evolution by natural selection. And last but not least, any sort of discordance, any disagreement between relationships or phylogenies inferred using DNA versus inferred using morphology and fossils. Again, we don't really see those, but those are observations that could, in theory, falsify common ancestry or evolution by natural selection. So let's talk about what some of the common criticisms are that are leveled in the media. And this is particularly true in the United States. First is that there's been too much change for evolution to explain. You frequently hear people say, I'm perfectly okay with microevolution, change within a species, small bits of change like the color in the peppered moth. But common ancestry, we have a common ancestor with bacteria or amoebae or plants? No way! There's just too much change. We'll talk about this in a second. You can't explain the complexity we see. So one example you frequently hear is that of the eye. The eye is too complex, and half an eye doesn't work. Well, it's true, half an eye doesn't work, but that's not how evolution would have made the eye. It wouldn't have made one half and then the other half. One that's come up is, why isn't it still happening? So Republican strategist Christine O'Donnell here in the United States said, why aren't monkeys still evolving into humans? We don't see these half human, half monkeys out there, obviously. Yeah, we'll come back to that. And last but not least, that it doesn't explain life's origin or denies the existence of God. We'll come back to each of these points. So first, let's talk about the too much change argument. Now, it's very difficult to conceive of time in the context of the age of the Earth. And I think this is where the challenge comes in, and when people say, well, there's been too much change. There's no way you could have that much change. Well, let's look at some things where we do know the history of what's happened. So let's look at dogs. Dogs experienced artificial selection through our human breeding. There's no fundamental difference genetically in terms of what happens with artificial selection versus natural selection. There's just one case when we apply it versus another case where the environment applies it or competition or something like that. Dogs were domesticated only a few thousand years ago. Okay, so this is not a very long period of time. The breeds that we in fact see today, so things like the Great Dane, Chihuahua, Collies, all those great things, most of those are only a few hundred years old. Yet we see striking diversity. We actually see different forms, as you see from this picture here. There are forms that look like they barely could even interbreed. They don't even necessarily look like the same species. So this is a fairly dramatic change over the course of a few hundred years. Now, how old is the Earth? Well, the Earth is on the order of, the Earth is like 5 billion years, but life has been on Earth for an estimated 3.5 billion years. Well, it's hard to relate to this number. Like if I tell you something like something happened 3,000 years ago, you say, okay, that was a long time ago. If I say something happened 3 billion years ago, you say, okay, that was a long time ago. But it's hard to relate to the difference in scale there between those two things because it's so much longer than human lifetimes. So let me put this in sort of a scale that we actually can relate to. How many times over could dog breeds have evolved? How many times over and over again could dog breeds have evolved? Well, if 1,000 years were a millimeter, 3.5 billion years would be 3.5 kilometers. So look at something like pull up a ruler for a second and look at it, and you'll see, okay, that's 1 millimeter, so that would have been dog breed. That would have been all the dog breeds. That would have been all the dog breeds. Do that over and over again for every millimeter, and do that until you've gone 3.5 kilometers down the road. That's a very, very, very long time. You could have evolved dog breeds over and over again, many, many, many times. So just to give you some scale, here's Manhattan, one of the boroughs of New York. There's 3.5 kilometers. Imagine counting that off a millimeter at a time. So really, I think the issue is that we can't conceive of the scale of time. And that's why people are very unwilling to accept the idea that you could get so much change. It's because we just can't conceive of the scale that we're talking about. Another criticism is this idea of too much complexity. And you often hear the things that you often hear people saying, well, that we don't see intermediates to eyes. Well, in fact, even the single-celled organism here, the euglena, has an eye spot photoreceptor. A simple photoreceptor is probably what was the first step into evolving what we see as the modern eye. The figure I show here on the slide depicts a series of events, starting with a simple photoreceptor with a nerve associated with it, up to the modern eye. And this is very, very easy to conceive of as having happened. So this shows you how something as complex as the eye could evolve through these simple steps, not involving a half eye or anything ridiculous like that. So let's talk briefly about why isn't this still happening? Well, there's a lot of incorrect assumptions with this argument. First, one of the assumptions is the formation of new species means the old species will be gone. That's absolutely not true. The second is this presumed directionality of evolution. Why should monkeys still be evolving into humans? There's a lot of problems with this, so let's go into several of them. First, new forms may be advantageous because they're exploiting different resources. So I have here a picture of several Darwin's finches. These are some of the finches that inspired Darwin for his theory. The top one here top left one is Geospiza magnirostrus. It's a woody seed eater, among other things. The one next to it is a cactus eater. Below it's an insect eater. Below that is a grub eater. So we see these different forms are exploiting all sorts of different resources. Now, presumably there was some ancient finch which actually got to the Galapagos and diversified into all these different forms. But it was advantageous to go into all these different new resources. So it helps to have all the forms, right? Like there's an advantage to each of them. Okay, so it's advantageous because they can exploit these distinct resources. The other thing, as I mentioned, is there's no directionality of evolution. History may not repeat itself. The late Stephen Jay Gould often used the analogy saying if you were to rewind the tape of life and play it again, would it actually unfold the same way? The answer is it may or may not. In a lot of cases, it may not. We may get something completely different. But there's a very crucial point, particularly with respect to this idea of man from monkeys. And that is humans did not evolve from chimpanzees or amoebae or anything else that is currently alive. Instead, this is a very important point, humans and all these other species share a common ancestor. That we go back in time, there was a common ancestor, and we have these modern species coming from it. All species, even single-celled ones, have changed over time. They have evolved over time. The amoeba has evolved over just as much time as the humans have. Just because if you go all the way back, we share that single same common ancestor. So there are no higher beings. This is a misrepresentation to think of it as we're higher and they are lower. There are definitely cases of simpler versus more complex, but there's no higher versus lower. There's no more evolved versus less evolved because the time frame is the same. So the last thing I want to touch on very briefly, because this comes up a lot, this idea that evolution doesn't explain life's origin or denies the existence of God. Now the first point is somewhat true, that when we look at most evolutionary theory, and most of the things we'll be talking about in this course, don't attempt to address how or why life arose. We're talking about how it's changed over time from the original life forms or from later life forms to the modern day life forms. So that's not something looking at that original origin of life. There are people who do try to understand that, but that's not where most evolutionary theory comes in. That doesn't mean it's bad or mistaken, it's just that's not what we're focusing on. The second part is untrue. There's no intrinsic theism or atheism to anything we've discussed or to anything about evolution. As you've seen before with the example I gave you with the squirrels and natural selection, it's a mathematical inevitability. It's only explaining what's happened. It's not saying anything about there is a God, there's not a God. And in fact, there are some biologists who support evolution who are also very devout in their faith. So one example being Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. Some of them, in contrast, are very devout atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, who's very outspoken about his atheism. There's nothing within evolutionary theory that speaks whatsoever to this idea of God or not God. There's nothing in that. And I will point out There are some faiths, however, that are adversarial towards evolution, where there are dogmas which come out saying that no, man was created in its modern form, things like that. That is not an issue with evolution. That is an issue with the faith failing to accept it. So it's using arguments outside the realm of science. So it's up to you how you wish to evaluate those. But if you want some other materials to look at, I encourage you to see an interview with Jerry Coyne, which is found online. He's the author of the book Why Evolution is True. He's a very outspoken advocate for evolution and very eloquent in the way he presents things. So I encourage you to look at that, and I hope you've enjoyed these videos so far. Thank you.